Hello everybody, it's your favorite history instructor with our digital lecture on the civil rights struggle, or at least a very brief overview of a very tense few years with people fighting for equality. So we'll kind of look here at some of the different ways in which African Americans were gaining rights, so some of the different tactics and principles used, and look at some of those key figures as well. So again, you have to put up with the video, but you're welcome to stop and take notes and review it as much as you desire. And you don't have to see my face to do it either. So, moving along then. Maybe. Are we moving? Alright. One of the first real incidents that captures the public's eye involves Rosa Parks in 1955. So on December 1st of 1955, actually, I guess today is the day I'm recording this, is the anniversary of that, with some number of math years, 2013 minus 1955, whatever that is. I'll let someone else figure out, pause and figure it out if you want to. But on this day, back in 1955, Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for what I assume you all know, that she refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white patron. So that was the local law there in Montgomery with the buses, that black people were supposed to sit in the back or move to the back if there were white people without seats. And Parks, who was a member of the local group of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, refused to do that. She said, look, I'm an American citizen. I should have the same rights as anyone regardless of the color of my skin, and she is arrested for refusing to give up her seat there in Montgomery, Alabama. So a local attorney is called in, Martin Luther King Jr., he's going to represent her. He's a pastor, just recently gotten his degree from up at Boston University, and King is going to organize nonviolent means of trying to change this law, to say, okay, how do we respond to this unfair situation that Rosa Parks and other blacks have found themselves in? Well, we don't want to use violence. King doesn't endorse that. So he organizes this Montgomery Bus Boycott. So for about a year, what this means, or 11 months, citizens of Montgomery who want to protest the unfair discrimination will refuse to ride on the bus. So this is a time when, especially in the black community, not many people had cars. The blacks were the largest percentage of riders of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system, and they would go for miles and miles on foot and refuse to get on board the bus. It's a means of civil disobedience. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. Is going to embrace. So by civil disobedience, it's a way of saying, okay, we realize this is an unfair law. We're not going to follow that law, but we're not going to use violence. We're not going to resort to that level. He learns a lot from Gandhi in India, who peacefully protested the policies of the British, who were taking advantage and mistreating the people of India until the British allowed India to have its independence in the 1940s, and then Gandhi was later assassinated. But the Montgomery Bus Boycott is an example of a nonviolent protest or civil disobedience. They're finding out ways to civilly protest a law. So for months and months, these people in Montgomery refused to ride the bus. And as one who has lived in Alabama, let me tell you, it gets really hot. And so these people throughout the summer are walking miles through the sauna that is the state of Alabama, refusing to give in because they want to see this unfair law overturned. So they are fully committed to that. There was a famous incident where a news reporter, I think, pulled up to an elderly black woman and asked her if she wanted a ride, and she said, "No, sir, my feet is weary, but my soul is rested." And so that idea that they were so committed. And so finally, the Alabama court system concludes that the discrimination law is indeed unconstitutional. So they will change that law, and the bus boycott succeeds in driving the bus company into bankruptcy because they weren't getting the patronage that they needed. There weren't enough people to ride the bus. So these people, through their peaceful protests, were able to overturn an unfair and discriminatory law there in Montgomery, Alabama. More civil disobedience happened famously up in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Woolworth sit-in in 1960. Woolworths, which is really hard for me to say, it was kind of like a drugstore that sort of has everything like a Walgreens or your CVS, but there was also a lunch counter in these Woolworths. Similar maybe, except on a smaller level to how, wait a second, I'm trying to think in the Greenwood Walmart if we have a McDonald's. But anyway, a small little diner included within the drugstore or the little market store. So blacks were allowed to shop in the store for the goods that they needed, but they were not allowed to sit at the lunch table part of the restaurant. And there were these 4 very young and very brave college students at North Carolina A&T who said, okay, this is an unfair law as well. Why are we being discriminated against? We're allowed to spend our money in the store, but they won't take our money at the lunch counter. So these students sat down one day in 1960 in Greensboro at the Woolworths counter. Everybody said, what are you doing? You can't sit down here. And they refused to get up. And they were joined throughout the day by more and more people, blacks and whites, who wanted to side with them, who were inspired by their courage. They stayed there despite people wanting to beat them up, despite people wanting to arrest them, and other people join them. They kind of spill into the streets, into other restaurants, and the sit-in movement leads Woolworths to change its policy on allowing blacks to eat at the lunch tables. So again, another really famous example, and not too far from where we live, of means of civil disobedience and courageous people taking a stand for what's right and what's fair. This really, the sit-ins, and that was in 1960. The sit-ins inspired the development of a new organization known as SNCC. So even though there's no I in there, people just call it SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So this was formed in the early 1960s as young people are inspired, again, largely by the sit-in movement, to say, look, we can make changes ourselves. So students willing to seek changes, willing to go through nonviolent tactics and principles, civil disobedience. They weren't going to physically resist authorities, but really committed to seeing change. So lots of big strides being made in terms of nonviolence. In education, as well as things, and this is why also the same decision is going to eventually apply to things like the bus boycott law. There was a really big, or the bus situation with blacks having to give up their seats. There was a really big Supreme Court case back in 1954, so before the sit-ins, before Rosa Parks, called Brown versus the Board of Education. And what happened here was that several families, it wasn't just one family named Brown, but Brown gets the credit for it. Several families joined together, and it was based out of Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, to say, why should our black children have to ride miles and miles and miles to the black school when there's a white school much closer in? And the reason the schools were segregated was, of course, because of Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1896, that I'm sure everybody remembers. Plessy versus Ferguson established that separate but equal doctrine to say, okay, if the schools are or schools or anything else, train cars, water fountains, they are allowed to be separate if they are providing the same services. So people were justifying kind of this separation and segregation and racism in overall by saying, okay, it's the same services, so the black school provides the same services as the white school, even though the black schools were inferior, they didn't get as much money, they had poor textbooks. But in Brown versus Board of Education, the blacks really, this was another means of civil disobedience in a way. They weren't really disobeying things, but a way of changing things. The NAACP was really trying to change laws through the court system. So there were lots of people doing protests, kind of the civil disobedience, but then also seeking to change laws through the courts. The lawyer for the NAACP and for Brown was Thurgood Marshall. So he represents the Brown family, the students who wanted to have the integrated schools. Marshall will later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. But Marshall and the NAACP win this case. And what this means is that Brown versus the Board of Education marks the end of separate but equal. Now you can start legally integrating things, because they said separate but equal is unconstitutional. They said by nature if something is separate, then they're unequal. So, landmark decision, great job. Everybody, you would think, okay, we can move forward. Here's where the problem comes in with the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court can interpret laws. That's their job, their role, according to the U.S. Constitution. But the Supreme Court doesn't have any power to enforce the decisions. They rely on government officials to enforce the decisions. So this case is made, but nobody in Washington, President Dwight Eisenhower and then congressmen, they aren't really advocating big changes to be made. And so schools especially are going to be very, very reluctant to make these changes if nobody's pressuring them into doing that. And this situation reaches new tensions with the famous Little Rock Nine. Here they are with one of their advisors here. The Little Rock Nine are based in Arkansas. And these are 9 students who in 1957, so 3 years after the Supreme Court case, which ended separate but equal, are going to take on the state of Arkansas to try to get the schools integrated, to allow blacks and whites to attend the same schools. And these 9 students want to try to enter the all-white Central High School. Huge, imposing high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Not exactly your Emerald High or even your big Greenwood High. So massive high school. Just imagine how scared these students must have been. I mean, young people your age going to try to make this stand and facing all kinds of resistance. People spitting in their faces, people threatening to kill them, abuse them, beat them up. The governor of Arkansas is a man with the sexy name of Orval Faubus. Why you name your kid that if your last name is Faubus, or why you name your kid Orval anyway, I don't really know. It's probably just offended somebody whose dad is named Orval. Anyway, Orval Faubus is the governor of Arkansas. He's a good old boy. He refuses to allow the Little Rock Nine to enter Central High in 1957. He says this is not going to happen. There will be blood in the streets if they try to enter. Orval Faubus summons the National Guard, and he has the National Guard block these students from entering the high school. So the Little Rock Nine cannot enter the high school. So he's called in the National Guard to keep 9 black students from entering Central High School. This is an embarrassment for President Eisenhower. It goes up to the national level, and the president, who had been reluctant to get involved in all of this, had to call in Army paratroopers 1,000 Army paratroopers in 1957 had to come to Little Rock, Arkansas to protect these 9 kids who wanted an education at Central High in Little Rock. So for the whole year, these paratroopers, 1,000 Army paratroopers, protected these 9 kids because Faubus and others in Arkansas were so opposed to the integration of public schools. So major, we see that as people are trying to promote legal change, there are a lot of people who are really, really resistant to that, and the national government is having to get involved by protecting these people. Faubus, just in the end, he kind of wins out, just to show you how slow he is to adapt. The next year, what he does is he closes down the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, so that he says, well, if the president's going to do this, if he sends them in, then I'm just going to shut down the schools. So he actually closed down the high school the next year so that nobody could get an education, which explains a lot about Arkansas. Anyway, at the college level, too, there was a lot of resistance. James Meredith became the first black to try to enroll at the University of Mississippi, known as Ole Miss, in 1962. So 62, James Meredith tries to enter Ole Miss. If you like sports, one of the 30 for 30 documentaries that ESPN does was on James Meredith and Mississippi's football team in 1962. But in 62, John Kennedy was president, and Kennedy had to send 500 marshals, so U.S. marshals, to protect James Meredith. So once again, major resistance. Several marshals are injured. So deep resistance as people are trying to make these changes. So a very, very tense time as people fight for equality in the Deep South and other places in the country as well. There's, on the legislative level, again, there wasn't a lot done right after Brown versus Board of Education. The government didn't do much to get things going and moving. But in 1964, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. So after lots of situations with sit-ins, with people being killed and injured throughout the country, the Civil Rights Act is signed in 64. There you see Lyndon B. Johnson signing it, Martin Luther King Jr. In the back, still supporting nonviolence. MLK is not a perfect guy by any means. Was quite unfaithful to his wife as he went from place to place, but still very committed to these causes of fighting for equality. And so this law, which I think is explained in on page in chapter 28 on page 858, it outlaws racial discrimination in public places. That doesn't do anything about private racial discrimination. And it also creates the equal employment opportunity, which is still around today. Basically, kind of your affirmative action in jobs. So the equal EEOC is still around today as part of that Civil Rights Act. So it's trying to end public discrimination at places like universities and schools. What that didn't touch was the voting issue, and that's where in Mississippi, the video that you have a quiz on is based on Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, where lots of whites from the North come down to try to help blacks register to vote in Mississippi because they were still ways of discriminating against blacks without saying, well, we're not discriminating against them. If they can just pass this literacy test, then they can vote. And that leads to lots of violence and murders, as you'll see in the video documentary if you haven't watched that yet. And so Johnson then signs the Voting Rights Act in 1965, kind of as a result of that. So it allows what basically the federal government takes control, or has to really monitor the situation in the South to make sure that there are no tests that discriminate against blacks as they try to register to vote. Still in the South today, like after the census, when they do some redistricting, like in South Carolina after the 2010 census, we gained a seat in Congress because more people moved to South Carolina. So it's still, that redistricting still had to be approved by the federal government because of the Voting Rights Act. In North Carolina, there's recently been a voter ID law passed because lots of people can go to the polls and commit fraud. Like there are tons and tons of, hundreds of thousands of dead people registered to vote in North Carolina. So now they say, okay, you have to have a photo ID, and a lot of people have, that's been in the news a lot the past few months because people have said, does this violate the Voting Rights Act of 65 because minorities are less likely to have a photo ID. So the government really takes a lot of oversight on voting activity to ensure that blacks are able to freely register to vote in the South and are not discriminated against. So a lot of that's going on in the South, and we hear about racial issues in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, but it becomes a major national thing. And there's a lot more black resistance outside of the South. In the South, there will be some race riots, but mainly blacks have been in a situation of fear, and in northern places there will be much more antagonism between the two. In 1965, the Watts riots happened in Los Angeles. Over 30 people are killed as blacks and whites fight against one another there. Over 40 people are killed a couple of years later in Detroit over a situation involving police discrimination. So hundreds and hundreds of people are injured in these riots, in addition to many, many deaths. Violence does happen in the South as well. Just in Orangeburg, it was what's known as the Orangeburg Massacre in 1968 that left, I think, 3 people dead after a situation at a bowling alley. But there's a lot of tension in the North, and your book kind of goes into, if you want to read more about it, on page kind of about 864, 866, in that area, about why it is that the nonviolence issue, the nonviolence isn't working as well in the North. And so things are scary in these cities. They're intense. People die. There is great bloodshed. And so what's happening is that in the South, where there's more peaceful protests and peaceful nonviolent resistance, for the most part, and some exceptions, obviously, like in Orangeburg, in the North, there's a lot more violence. And there are more people who feel discriminated against, especially in neighborhoods where they're living closer together, and blacks having worse neighborhoods. And that leads to a kind of a change in mentality. There are more people who want segregation, more people willing to use violence. One of those people was the famous Malcolm X. Malcolm X was arrested at an early age and joined a group known as the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is not the same thing as mainstream Islam. It's a group of black nationalists. So they're kind of like a segment of Islam, or a little subgroup, not mainstream by any means. But the Nation of Islam taught that whites were devils. They wanted complete separation between blacks and whites. Malcolm X will support the use of violence when necessary to defend oneself. So he's a very militant person, very embracing of the black race, not willing to cooperate with whites or really non-violent tactics like what Martin Luther King Jr. used at all. He does actually sort of have a changing experience. If you're familiar with mainstream Islam, one of the 5 pillars that you're supposed to follow is things you're supposed to do is if you're physically able, you're supposed to take a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And Malcolm X does that, and it seems to kind of change his views as he sees more of a mainstream Islam with all the different nationalities and ethnic groups together then. And he comes back to the United States and he has tempered views. So he's changed a lot. He sees some corruption in the Nation of Islam, so he tries to leave that group, and they actually murder him in 1965. But that's the idea of wanting blacks and whites to be separate was something that a lot of blacks up in the North were promoting, and they were calling on taking more drastic steps. Stokely Carmichael was a guy who made a famous speech first using the words of black power. Carmichael had been, in the early 1960s, a supporter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of civil disobedience. He was one of the leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But by the mid to late 60s, his views have shifted, and he doesn't want white help. He talks about the Black Power movement endorsing, kind of instead of yielding to try to integrate, trying to really change the perspective. And people are becoming more radical as a result of this. All sorts of Black Power things, the famous fist in the air symbol. You get your combs for your afros with the Black Power fist. Signs at the Olympics in the 1960s in Mexico City of the track and field guys with their fists in the air symbolizing Black Power. Carmichael will actually, what happens is SNCC will kick out and expel its white members. So what had started as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with that symbol of the white and black hands shaking now will expel white members and say, we don't want your help anymore. This is a black movement. So things getting more radical and depressing in some ways is kind of one of the ironic things was that so many people had been fighting for integration, and now there are more people fighting for segregation to say we need to keep separate. One of the most radical groups that really takes that Black Power movement to the extreme will be the Black Panthers, wanting to live in all black neighborhoods, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale here. They'd have their famous berets, always be armed, and they wanted their black communities to be nonviolent, but they were very willing to pick up weapons, and you see this intimidation idea here to intimidate whites as they fight for their black rights. So really different movements, really different figures, really different tactics, really different principles as people say, how do we solve this issue that has divided the nation in so many ways? And so in some ways you see steps forward in the 50s and 60s, in some ways you see steps backward, but all things to learn from and things that still touch home on some heartstrings today, and get more tumultuous with murder of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, which is an awful year in general. It's a bad year in Vietnam. Robert Kennedy is assassinated that year, JFK's brother. So really, really, really tense times, and some victories for sure, but difficult times in the United States, and they continue to kind of worsen in the 1970s. So in some ways what's going on in the 60s and 70s with Vietnam and some domestic issues like Watergate that you'll read about, those things almost kind of start to overshadow the accomplishments of civil rights. But on that uplifting note, I'll call it the end.